Age of Imperialism, 1750 to 1917. The 19th century witnessed the acceleration of a global trend that began with the voyages of Columbus at the late 15th century and the Age of Discovery. Since then, Europeans or colonists of European ancestry had been spreading out around the world as traders, settlers, and conquerors and disseminating their culture and technology. In the 1800s, the process intensified as more Western nations embarked on imperial ventures and brought much of Asia and Africa under European influence or control. You must think that even at this time in the New World, where the Spanish-American Empire collapsed, the European heritage remained strong, and dreams of empire endured. The leader of Mexico, after it broke with Spain in 1821, proclaimed himself emperor. The first president elected in the 19th century, Thomas Jefferson, saw the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and launched an empire of liberty that spanned the continent by mid-century and reached across the Pacific by 1900. The era was propelled by steam and electrical power and energized by industrialism, capitalism, and nationalism. Proud young nations with booming economies like the United States and Germany chased after the world leaders, Britain and France. Exhilarating for some, imperialism proved deeply unsettling for native people colonized by the major powers. Imperialism brought the world together and exposed it to the unprecedented perils, setting the stage for global conflicts in the 20th century. So in the age of imperialism, we're talking about European imperialism during the 19th century, and then also Pacific imperialism of the 19th century. So what we want to keep in mind is that during the 19th century, the British had control over India. They had colonized India, and the Europeans also colonized Africa. So by the time World War I started, Africa was mostly divided into many different parts by anywhere between 5 and 10 different countries. And in any case, we will go over the 19th century. If you want to see a further dive into 19th century history with industrialism, I have 2 videos on that in one of my history lectures on my history lecture playlist. So at the end of this video, instead of going over the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, I will simply just briefly mention some of the inventions and the notable dates in the 19th century as it pertains to industrialism. European imperialism. 1800 to 1900. European imperialism, or empire building, had its origins in the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. Imperialism did not become a global phenomenon until the late 1400s, when European navigators opened up routes to the riches of Asia and sources of wealth in the Americas. Those discoveries led to economic exploitation of Asian countries by various European powers and large-scale colonization of the New World by Spain, France, and England. Beginning in the mid-1700s, European imperialism entered a new phase. First, France, then Britain and Spain lost most of their American colonies to rival powers or independence movements. Around the same time, Britain and other European nations tightened their hold on India, as did the British and other Asian countries, and went on to explore and exploit Africa. The Industrial Revolution and growth of capitalism gave developed nations ever greater advantages over undeveloped countries and allowed Europeans to dominate those countries economically without colonizing or occupying them. China, for example, felt the impact of imperialism in the 19th century without becoming a colony. By the time European imperialism reached its peak in the late 1800s, few places in the world were unaffected by this empire building. In the race for imperial supremacy, the British took the lead after 1750. France was Britain's closest rival, and other nations joined in the competition. We must understand that really European imperialism started around 1750. imperialism in the Pacific really didn't start around 1800. But by the year 1900, the British Empire was in a class all by itself, embracing nearly one-fourth of the Earth's territory and some 400 million people. Crucial to British success was the role private enterprise played. The loss of the Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-American colonies in 1783 was offset by the addition of India to the empire through the prodigious efforts of the British East India Company, which outdid the rival French East India Company militarily and economically. Not until 1858 would British officials take formal control of India, but British capitalists paved the way for that acquisition a century earlier. India was described with good reason as the jewel in Britain's crown. European powers sought colonies as cheap sources of raw materials and markets for manufactured goods. India served Britain in both respects. Among the items Britain exported from India was opium, forcibly introduced to China, where millions grew addicted to it. Among the goods imported to India was British cloth, which overwhelmed India's textile trade. Imperialists or empire builders helped modernize India and other countries by introducing technologies such as steam power and railroads, but they kept those nations economically dependent on Europe and thwarted progress towards economic and political self-determination. And so we see that India was driven on by British imperialism and the products of 19th century industrialism. So taking and holding India involved the British and other imperial ventures beyond its boundaries. Britain twice went to war with China in the mid-1800s when authorities there tried to halt the flow of opium from India. British forces took control of parts of Burma in 1824 to safeguard India and later colonized Malaya for the same reason. Completion of the Suez Canal in 1869 shortened the maritime route to India and enhanced British trade. In 1882, to protect its interest in the canal, Britain sent troops to quell a nationalist uprising in Egypt and took control there, which soon led to British intervention in the Sudan. Britain's expansion in Africa and Asia prompted other nations, notably France, to seek their own overseas colonies and empires, if only to prevent Britain from achieving global supremacy. French interest in overseas colonies receded after the British took control of French Canada in 1763. Napoleon Bonaparte reacquired Louisiana from Spain in 1801, but sold that territory to the United States 2 years later to help finance his campaigns. Napoleon's defeat by his European rivals in 1815 left France with little empire, but the imperial dream lived on. In 1830, French troops occupied Algiers on the North African coast. Their stated purpose was to stop pirates from preying on ships in the Mediterranean, but the French remained in Algeria and colonized it. By the 1850s, France was back in the imperial race in earnest under Emperor Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, or Napoleon III, who set out to establish a global empire. In 1857, his forces completed the conquest of Algeria. In the early 1860s, French troops intervened in Mexico and dominated it for several years before withdrawing under United States pressure. In 1862, France occupied the southern part of present-day Vietnam and colonized that country as well as what is now Cambodia and Laos. Napoleon III was deposed in 1870 after suffering a humiliating defeat at the hands of Prussia, which emerged as a master of a unified German empire. But the return of Republican rule in France did nothing to lessen imperial fervor there. In years to come, France greatly expanded its domain in northwest Africa. Britain responded to the competition by allowing private interests to infiltrate the continent. In the late 1800s, diamond magnate Cecil Rhodes of the British South Africa Company replicated the feats of the British East India Company by building a commercial empire that laid the foundation for British control of Rhodesia and other South African countries. The imperial rivalry between Britain and France was heated, but they avoided war and sometimes cooperated against mutual adversaries. In 1854, British and French troops joined forces to support the Ottoman Turks against Russia in the Crimean War. The Ottoman Empire was declining while the Russian Empire was advancing around the Black Sea and posing a challenge to British and French interests. Russia lost the Crimean War and shifted its ambitions to Asia, where it clashed with a newly imperialist Japan in the early 1900s. Japan, like the United States, was a rising power intent on ending European domination of the globe. Also vying for status were the young nations of Germany, Italy, and Belgium, all of which had colonies in Africa by 1900. Old imperialist nations such as Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands clung to possessions in Africa and Asia and in the hope of restoring their former glory. If we look at the United States, however, in comparison to Britain, the United States did not become a formalized power until the late 1900s, particularly 1897 during the presidency of William McKinley. However, ironically, the frenzy for colonies reached its peak as the risks and cost of imperialism grew increasingly apparent, diminishing zeal for colonial exploits among those most involved in them. For the British imperialism lost some of its luster when their troops suffered heavy losses battling the Dutch-speaking peoples, the original colonists of South Africa, who resisted domination. More than 250,000 British troops fought in the Boer War that began in 1899. Britain won, but soon recognized South Africa as a dominion under the control of the Boers, who had no intention of sharing power with the oppressed black majority. Fierce imperial and colonial conflicts engulfed large parts of the world in the 20th century. Imperialism, long considered a noble pursuit by people of European heritage, fell into disrepute as colonizers, and the people they colonized reckoned with its bitter consequences. In 1876, Britain's Queen Victoria received a new title in which she took particular pride, Empress of India. Since ascending to the throne in 1837, at the age of 18, she had taken a keen interest in the growth of the British Empire. After the Indian Mutiny of 1857 against the British East India Company, she wrote proudly that there was now a universal feeling in England that India should belong to me. A year later, the British government disbanded the troubled company and assumed control of India, clearing the way for Victoria to become Empress of that country. She took that role seriously and argued forcefully that Britain should do everything necessary to uphold its imperial prestige. Quote, "If we are to retain our position as a first-rate power, we must, with our Indian empire and large colonies, be prepared for attacks and wars somewhere or other continually." End quote. Even as she asserted her own authority in Britain's on the world stage, however, Queen Victoria presided over the dawning of a new age in which the country's monarch came to play a reduced role in government in relation to its elected leaders, and Britain began to allow some of its colonies a measure of autonomy. One of her last official acts before she died in 1901, meaning that she ruled for 64 years, was to sign a bill recognizing Australia as a self-governing dominion. The advantages of dominion status were first granted to countries with populations of largely European heritage like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, but the British Commonwealth grew to include many former colonies with largely non-European populations, easing their passage to independence. Of course, although she was a proud monarch and staunch imperialist, Victoria's greatest legacy may have been that she left Britain a more democratic nation with a capacity to foster self-rule in countries it long dominated. Europe's Industrial Revolution, we have notable dates. 1769, Richard Arkwright introduces the spinning frame. James Watt improves the steam engine efficiency. In 1785, Edmund Cartwright's power loom is the death knell for hand loom weavers. In 1830, rail service between Liverpool and London is started by George Stephenson. In 1837, Samuel F.B. Morse exhibits the telegraph, revolutionizing communications. In 1840, Samuel Cunard's Britannia inaugurates steamship service between Britain and North America. In 1856, Henry Bessemer's converter makes steel economical to produce. In 1866, the Simons brothers' open hearth furnace makes possible the refining of scrap metal into steel. In 1866, on his third attempt, Cyrus Field lays the first successful transatlantic cable. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell invents the telephone and 1 year later establishes the Bell Telephone Company. In 1879, Thomas Edison improves the incandescent light bulb. In 1895, Guglielmo Marconi sends his first radio signals 1.5 miles. In 1898, Rudolf Diesel receives a patent for the diesel engine. Imperialism in the Pacific, 1800 to 1900, respectively. As the 19th century progressed, first Europe and then the United States and Germany began to look toward Oceania in the Pacific as their next stop for colonization. In addition to Australia and the larger islands of Indonesia and New Zealand, the Pacific contained thousands of small, scattered isles, valuable not only as trading stations, but also as strategic points and refueling stops for coal-burning ships. The Dutch had a long history in Indonesia, having traded in the Spice Islands since the 16th century. Those interests extended to New Guinea, and in 1828 they annexed the western part of that island. Other nations were also interested in New Guinea, especially the Germans, who had become powerful in Europe and were interested in expanding into the Pacific. This made the Australian colonies nervous, and as early as 1873 they asked London to claim the non-Dutch half of New Guinea. When Britain dallied, the Queensland government claimed possession of eastern New Guinea, but Britain disallowed it. By the time Britain acted, the Germans had already claimed the northeastern part and a nearby archipelago. Britain had to settle for the southeastern corner, today's Papua New Guinea. Meanwhile, numerous other small islands were being snapped up by the major powers. Although the French were more interested in developing their interest in Indochina at the time, France took over the Marquesas, annexed the Loyalty Islands, and made Tahiti a colony. The British annexed the island of Fiji, north of New Zealand, and established protectorates over the Cook Islands, the Gilberts, and the Ellis Islands. Sometimes nations banded together to avoid too much concentration under one power. Great Britain and France, for instance, accepted joint sovereignty over the New Hebrides. The Samoan Islands, with their fine harbor at Pago Pago, also tempted several countries. The United States, Germany, and Great Britain separately made treaties with the Samoans that gave them rights to naval stations in the islands, working with rival chieftains and raising competitive ire among the three powers. In 1889, a fortuitous tropical storm sank all but one of the warships in Samoa. In the enforced peace, an agreement was forged among the three countries for a joint protectorate of the islands. Although the United States had not been a major player in Pacific expansion until the 1880s or so, it now began to act more aggressively. The Naval Act of 1890 built a new United States Navy, which needed new United States bases, a renewed interest in foreign markets, a sense of competition with European powers, and revival of the idea of manifest destiny also played a part in propelling the country into the Pacific. After Spain lost to the United States in the Spanish-American War, it gave up many of its holdings in the Pacific. As part of the treaty, Spain ceded the Philippine Islands and Guam to the United States in 1898, and it sold the Carolines and Marianas to Germany. The new surge of expansionism also sealed the fate of the Hawaiian Islands, one of the most remote sets of islands in the world. They had an interesting history of human influence. The first people arrived there around CE 500, late in the history of the world settlement. Tahitians then invaded and won control over the islands around 1200. But they largely escaped European notice until the 1770s, when explorer James Cook visited them and was subsequently killed by natives in 1779. The first American missionaries arrived in 1820. In 1824, the Hawaiian king and queen arrived in London to offer the islands to King George IV. But both died of measles before they could be presented to the monarch. In 1826, Hawaii signed a treaty of friendship and commerce with the United States, and in the 1830s signed treaties with Britain and France. In 1840, a representative government was established in Hawaii, but a number of Americans were appointed by the king to administrative and judicial offices. By this time, sugar planters had allowed the missionaries to go to the islands, and they had gone to the islands themselves, and they had built up a substantial American merchant community, complete with plantations, railroads, hotels, and banks. Nevertheless, in 1842, the United States recognized the independence of the islands, and in 1843, Britain and France did the same and promised not to annex them. But the islands had become valuable as products of sugar and pineapples, and as an important coaling station in the middle of the ocean. So many native Hawaiians were increasingly unhappy with the foreign dominion of their affairs. In 1891, when Queen Liliuokalani came to the throne, she made it clear that she would throw off foreign control. Within 2 years, members of her cabinet who supported United States annexation demanded her abdication, and the United States Marines came ashore to support them. Regretfully, Liliuokalani Liliuokalani surrendered to the superior forces of the United States of America. President Henry Harrison sent an annexation treaty to the United States Senate in February of 1893, but when Grover Cleveland was inaugurated a few days later, the new president delayed it. After sending a commissioner to investigate the situation, President Cleveland became convinced that most Hawaiians were opposed to the treaty and asked instead that Queen Liliuokalani be restored. But the pro-annexation government in Hawaii refused to bring her back, and the matter stayed in dispute until 1897. The new United States president at the time, William McKinley, was pro-expansion, and he signed a treaty that completed the annexation of Hawaii in 1898. It became a territory in 1900. The discovery of gold in the extreme south of Australia in 1851 brought a flood of immigrants to the continent. Isolated finds had occurred decades earlier, but the colonial government played them down, fearing a diversion of labor from the sheep stations. Large gold nuggets found at Ballarat, west of Melbourne, however, stirred such excitement that the 1851 population of 400,000 doubled within the next 8 years. Campsites became boom towns. The precious metal, some people said, was so plentiful it could be shaken from the roots of a pulled-up clump of grass. Britain had little trouble bestowing self-rule in Australia, whether because of its distance from the homeland, the independent nature of the people who went there, or lessons learned in North America. In 1850, the Australian Colonies Government Act, passed by the British Parliament, gave the colonies the right to form their own legislatures, write their own constitutions, and fix their own tariffs, all subject to confirmation by Britain. There were acts of rebellion. In 1854, a group of gold miners rebelled over voting rights and representation in the colonial legislature and declared a Republic of Victoria. They were crushed in one attack by government troops, and 13 of them were tried in Melbourne for treason. All went free, and a number of democratic reforms they sought were soon passed. By 1855, 4 separate colonies were scattered around the country, which covered an area almost that of the United States. They were New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and Tasmania off the south coast. Vast Western Australia gained a territorial government in 1890. Universal voting rights, vote by ballot, and payment of legislatures became realities in Australia before they did in the mother country. For a time, the colonies operated in total separation while all recognizing British sovereignty. In 1901, with the prospect of free trade with other British colonies and Germany threatening in nearby New Guinea, they formed the Commonwealth of Australia, an independent but part of the British realm. Already an independent part of the British Empire by 1856, New Zealand prospered in the second half of the 19th century. Land wars with the Maori people were resolved for better or worse by the 1870s. With the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the introduction of improved marine engines, and the advent of refrigerated ships in the 1880s, New Zealand developed a lively economy, shipping mutton, butter, and cheese to Britain. While building an economy based on small-scale, intensive farming, New Zealand's government also recognized that serious problems beset workers in their cities. Under liberal leadership late in the century, the country became known as a laboratory for social experimentation, with provisions for old age pensions and an 8-hour working day. It was the first country to allow women to vote in 1893 and to provide social security for its workers.